Sometime on the night of April 28th, 2025, or in the early hours of April 29th, two people climbed over a safety railing at one of the most photographed viewpoints in Bryce Canyon National Park. Below that railing was a drop of nearly 400 feet onto the canyon floor. Their bodies were found the next day by tourists walking the trail below. With them, still alive, was their cat. This is what is known about that night, what remains unknown, and what the investigation could and couldn't determine about how two people ended up on the wrong side of a railing built specifically to prevent exactly this outcome. Inspiration Point sits along the Rim Trail at Bryce Canyon National Park in south-central Utah, and the name is not an exaggeration. It is one of the park's most visited overlooks, a lookout perched above the canyon's famous hoodoos, the tall, narrow spires of orange and pink rock that Bryce Canyon is known for around the world. From the point, visitors look out across an amphitheater of thousands of these formations, catching some of the most photographed sunrise and sunset views in the entire national park system. Bryce Canyon receives more than 2 million visitors a year, and Inspiration Point is among the most popular stops on that visit. It is not a remote, unmarked scramble. It is a maintained overlook with a railing along the exposed edge and posted signage warning visitors to stay behind it. According to Bryce Canyon's Public Information Officer, B.J. Clough, this was the first fatality at that specific location in her memory working at the park. That detail matters. This was not a spot with a known history of accidents. It was, by all accounts, a safely designed overlook that had functioned exactly as intended for years. Matthew Nannon was 45. Bailey Crane was 58. Their last known permanent address was in Florida, but by the time they arrived at Bryce Canyon, that was no longer where they were living. According to the Garfield County Sheriff's Office, the two had spent time in Arizona before traveling to Utah, and at the time of their deaths they were, in the words of Sheriff spokesperson Wade Matthews, living in very austere conditions. They were unhoused, traveling and living out of a U-Haul that investigators later located in the area. Whatever brought them to that point in their lives, they had made their way to one of the most beautiful landscapes in the American Southwest, with their cat traveling with them, a detail that would become one of the more remarkable parts of this story. Beyond these facts, very little else about who they were to each other or what their lives looked like has been made public. What is known is what happened at the Overlook, pieced together after the fact by investigators working with limited evidence and no witnesses to the fall itself. It was a stormy Monday, April 28th, 2025, in Bryce Canyon National Park. Dark clouds had rolled in during the day, leaving a thin blanket of snow across the high-elevation rim trails. At over 8,000 feet, even late April nights can drop well below freezing, and the clay-rich soil that makes the park's famous hoodoos so striking turns treacherous when wet, slick, heavy, and unforgiving underfoot. Matthew Nannon, 45, and Bailey Crane, 58, had been traveling together, living out of a U-Haul van after recently spending time in Arizona. They were the kind of people drawn to the road and the wild places it led to. That evening, something pulled them to Inspiration Point, one of the park's most dramatic overlooks, where the amphitheater of orange hoodoos drops away into a seemingly bottomless sea of spires and canyons. The park was quiet. Most visitors had retreated from the cold and the weather, but the two made their way along the rim trail in the gathering darkness. Maybe the storm had cleared just enough to tempt them with the idea of seeing the canyon under different light, or perhaps the solitude of the road-weary travelers simply drew them to one more view before moving on. Whatever the reason, they reached the viewing area at Inspiration Point sometime late that night or in the very early hours of Tuesday morning. What happened next is where certainty ends and the tragedy becomes haunting. Investigators later confirmed that the pair deliberately climbed over the safety railing at the overlook. The railing was clearly marked, with posted signs warning visitors to stay behind it for their own safety. It was not a stumble or an accidental step. It was a conscious decision to go beyond the barrier and onto the unprotected edge. We can only imagine what led to that moment. Perhaps they wanted a better photograph in the dim light, chasing that perfect, dramatic shot of the hoodoos silhouetted against the stormy sky. Or maybe it was the pull of adventure that had already carried them across the country in a van, that feeling that the real experience lay just a few feet farther, past the line drawn for everyone else. In the cold, the wind, and the darkness, with the vast canyon opening up below them, the railing must have felt like an unnecessary limit. Once on the other side, the conditions turned deadly in an instant. The snow from the day had left the clay soil wet and greasy. In the near-total darkness, footing would have been nearly impossible to judge. One wrong shift of weight, one slippery patch of that slick clay, and balance would vanish. Investigators believe that is exactly what happened. They lost their footing on the treacherous, snow-slicked ground. Whether it was one of them slipping first and the other trying to help, or both losing stability at nearly the same moment, the result was the same. They fell approximately 380 feet down the sheer cliff face into the canyon below. The bodies were not found that night. They were discovered the next day, Tuesday, April 29th, by other visitors hiking below the viewpoint. Tourists who had come to Bryce Canyon for the same reason Nannon and Crane likely had, to see the hoodoos, to take in the view, to experience one of the most striking landscapes in Utah. Instead, they found two bodies at the base of the cliff. The discovery was reported to authorities around midday. By 1:50 in the afternoon, search and rescue units from Garfield County were already en route to the scene, working alongside a helicopter crew from the Utah Department of Public Safety's Aero Bureau. National Park Service rangers responded as well. Recovering bodies from a nearly 400-foot fall in canyon terrain like this is not a simple task. The terrain below Inspiration Point is steep, uneven, and difficult to access on foot, which is precisely why the helicopter crew was brought in, to extract the bodies from a location that ground teams alone would have struggled to reach safely and efficiently. The woman's body was recovered first, followed by the man's. A sheriff's office investigator used a rangefinder at the scene to measure the exact distance from the top of the overlook down to where the bodies had come to rest, arriving at the approximately 380-foot figure that would define how this story was reported everywhere it appeared. In the immediate aftermath, authorities faced a complication that added time to an already difficult process. They had a hard time locating next of kin, because Nannon and Crane were living unhoused, out of a vehicle, with no fixed address beyond a last known residence in Florida. Identifying them and notifying their families took longer than it might have for visitors with a clear home address and known emergency contacts. Detectives did not complete next of kin notifications until late Wednesday afternoon, more than a full day after the bodies were recovered, and roughly 2 days after the fall itself likely occurred. Their identities were publicly released only after those notifications were complete. Matthew Nannon, 45, and Bailey Crane, 58. The bodies were sent to the Utah State Medical Examiner's office, and the investigation into the exact circumstances of the fall continued from there. Among the details that made this story spread further than most park fatality reports was something no one expected to find at the scene: an elderly female cat still alive at the base of the same cliff her owners had fallen from. The cat had apparently been with Nannon and Crane at the overlook and made the same nearly 400-foot fall that killed both of them. She survived it. Details about her exact condition and what became of her afterward vary across reports, but the core fact remained consistent across every outlet that covered the story. An animal survived a fall that no human could withstand, found alive among the rocks and clay soil at the canyon floor near her owner's remains. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary outcome, and it says something about the specific terrain at the base of these cliffs, where a fall's outcome can depend enormously on exactly where and how something lands, even across a drop of that magnitude. Bryce Canyon's public information officer used the aftermath of this incident to make a point that applies to overlooks like Inspiration Point across the entire national park system. It's important that people recognize that those things are there for their safety, she said, referring to the railings and posted signage along the rim. This is a point worth sitting with, because railings at scenic overlooks are sometimes perceived by visitors as bureaucratic caution, obstacles between a person and the real view, the unobstructed photograph, the more adventurous vantage point just a few feet further out. That perception misunderstands what these barriers are actually protecting against. The terrain at the edge of Bryce Canyon's amphitheater is not uniform, stable rock. It is the same soft, erodible material that created the hoodoos in the first place, rock formations that exist precisely because this landscape erodes easily and unpredictably. The clay-based soil common throughout the rim becomes markedly unstable when wet, losing traction in ways that are not always obvious to someone standing on it, especially in low light or darkness. A step that would be perfectly safe on dry, stable ground can behave completely differently on saturated clay at the edge of a cliff. Railings at places like Inspiration Point are not positioned arbitrarily. They mark the boundary between terrain that has been assessed as reasonably stable for visitor use and terrain that has not. Terrain where the ground itself, not just the height of the drop, becomes the primary hazard. The investigation into what happened to Nannon and Crane never reached a definitive conclusion about the specific sequence of events that led to their fall. What can be said, based on the confirmed facts, is this. Two people crossed a marked safety barrier on a stormy night with snow on the ground and clay soil turned slick and unstable, in the dark, at the edge of a nearly 400-foot drop. Any one of those conditions alone might not have been enough to cause a fatal fall. Together, they created a situation where a single lost foothold, a single misjudged step in low visibility, was enough. This case differs in an important way from many of the other tragedies covered on this channel. There was no flash flood, no storm system tracked for hours in advance, no clear warning that went unheeded. The hazard here was more mundane and in some ways more universal, an edge, a railing, a decision to go past it, and terrain that did not forgive the mistake. For anyone visiting overlooks like Inspiration Point or similar viewpoints throughout the national park system, the takeaways from this incident are straightforward, even if the specific chain of events that night is not. Treat railings and posted barriers as boundaries defining safe terrain, not suggestions. They are placed based on an assessment of the ground itself, its stability, its erosion patterns, its behavior when wet, not merely to block a marginally better photo angle. Recognize that clay-based soils common in canyon country change dramatically with moisture. Rain, snowmelt, or overnight freeze-thaw cycles can turn stable-looking ground into a surface with little to no traction, especially near an edge where the consequences of a slip are severest. Be especially cautious at overlooks in darkness or low visibility. Depth perception, footing, and the ability to judge exactly where a stable edge ends are all significantly harder to assess at night, and many of the park's most scenic viewpoints are also the ones drawing visitors after sunset or before sunrise for photography. Matthew Nannon and Bailey Crane were found on a Tuesday afternoon in April at the base of one of the most photographed cliffs in Utah, roughly 380 feet below the railing marked with signs warning visitors to stay behind it. Their cat survived the same fall that killed them both, found alive among the rocks in one of the more improbable details in a story built almost entirely around uncertainty. The investigation never fully answered why two people climbed past that railing on a stormy, snow-covered night. What it did answer, clearly, is what waits on the other side of a barrier like that one. Unstable ground, darkness, and a drop that leaves no room for a single missed step. The railing had done its job for as long as anyone at the park could remember. It was there that night, too.